light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. I often remarked and try to explain myself to people, but I try not to let it be an excuse, but just an explanation. That I don't, because of my autism, maybe that's using it as an excuse. I am autistic, and I don't respond well to frustration. And I often lament that, as I'm dealing with it, insisting to God or guardian angels or whomever's listening, not everything in life has to be a frustration. It is perfectly acceptable for some things to go smoothly and to go well. They don't seem to be listening very much, because more often when I say that, I feel like I'm talking to myself. And so many things in life have been such a struggle for me that I slipped into, way back in my teenage years or before, I slipped into saying nothing good comes without a fight. And the idea being that you have to be willing to struggle if you want to accomplish anything. And those who are not willing to struggle, in all likelihood, don't accomplish near as much as those who are willing to struggle. So I've always been the one who's too stubborn to quit, which I guess is an autistic trait, but certainly not confined to autism. Too stubborn to quit. So when I was fixing up my house that I had, I lived in a mobile home on its own property at 10,000 feet for 3 years at one point, and in some ways wish I was still there, but it was a rather tenuous situation in other ways. And the environment I could have handled, the fixing up the house I could have handled, but the dangerous neighbors, I ultimately didn't have any way of keeping myself or my dogs adequately safe from them. And so I finally decided, if I'm the only one who has a problem with this kind of horrible behavior, then I guess I'll be the one to leave, because everyone else was willing to overlook it, and it wasn't getting any better. But there were numerous times as I was fixing up that house where things would be very frustrating and it wouldn't go the way I would want, and I would be so stubborn, and I would look at the board or the piece of plasterboard or whatever it was that I was struggling with, and I would say, you might as well give up, because you know I won't. And of course it didn't answer me or anything like that, but it was one of those emotional psychological coping strategies, I guess, to just look right at it and talk to it. Not because I believed it could hear, but because I needed to say it. But it was a way of affirming to myself also that no matter how frustrating this got, I was not going to give up until I got what I wanted. And I did. And over the course of 3 years, I rebuilt the entire thing into this amazing place to live, that when we had a particular snowstorm, because I so tightly sealed the house, I had and put in so much insulation, I had made the house all electric so that there was nothing burning, no gas furnace, nothing like that. It was all electric. So I would open the windows to exchange the air every so often, but when it needed to be, when it was really cold, I could shut the windows and have the place be totally sealed. Well, we had a particularly bad snowstorm, and over the course of, on Sunday, the snowstorm started on Sunday, and the power went out, and there was no electricity to the house. So I had no heat, no electricity of any kind from Sunday night, and the power didn't come back on again until Wednesday. So it's basically 3 days. Yeah, basically 3 days with no electricity, no electric heat, no electric anything. But I had put so much insulation in the walls, and in combination with the snow, because over the course of 3 days, I shoveled 8 feet of snow out of the driveway. It's the only time in my life when I've shoveled 8 feet of snow out of a single driveway. Because I went out at one point when the snow was about 4 feet deep and shoveled out the whole driveway. And then a day or so later I had to do it again, and it was another 4 feet. And so the house was totally buried in snow. I mean, I literally had to shovel my way out the front door because there was no way of getting out of the house because the snow had piled up so deep. And it was like walking through this little canyon of snowbanks that were taller than my head. But there was no electric heat during all that time. But there was so much insulation, and the added insulation of the snow on the roof, the house didn't lose more than 5 or 6 degrees each day. So that after 3 days with no heat, it was still about 55 degrees inside the house. Nowhere near any dangerous temperature. So we had lots of blankets and coats, and my dogs and I were fine. And on the 4th day, the sun came out, and the snowstorm stopped, and everything started melting, and the power came back on, and everything was fine. But it was it could have been an experience of frustration. But I had already been through the frustration of rebuilding the house and saying at various points, you might as well give up because I won't. And then being in that situation, cut off from the world because of 8 feet of snow on the road. The road was closed for a whole week. But there was enough food in the house. There was enough heat that we didn't freeze or anything. And as soon as the sun came out, Colorado being what it is, the snow has so much air in it that it began evaporating very quickly. And as little as a week after the snowstorm ended, 90% of the snow was gone. It just all evaporated away and everything became manageable again. Which I guess that's one of the things to remember about frustrations. One of my viewers asked me to say something about how do you cope with frustration? Well, remembering that the frustration is finite. It doesn't last forever. It never does. There is always a beginning point and an ending point. And it's an invitation to use all your ingenuity and all your brainstorming and all your friends, and even talk to your elders, anyone who's available, and ask them, so how did you cope with this sort of challenge? And what did you do? And you don't have to do exactly like they did, but how they coped with the same challenge may give you an idea that you hadn't thought of before. And suddenly you go, that's it, thank you. And they look at you and say, what did I say? I don't remember telling you any answer. But something they said triggered a thought in your head, and it's like, now I know what to do. And the frustration at that point is basically fleeing in the distance because you have found a way to totally overcome it. But the thing that I advise all my friends, because as I said, I don't deal well with frustration. I get very irate, I appear angry. I'm not angry at anyone, I'm angry at the situation. And it's kind of like in the movie Ordinary People, when the young boy goes to his psychologist and reports that his friend has committed suicide, and the psychiatrist says, oh, so now you're going to take responsibility for that too, and blame yourself for that? He says, no, I just feel bad about it, and just let me feel bad about it. And after a pause, the psychiatrist says, yeah, I feel bad too. And to sit with that emotion and accept it for what it is, accept it for happening. If you have sufficient presence of mind, reminding yourself that it won't always be this way. This experience is locked within time. It has a beginning, it has an end. It's not how I'll feel for the rest of my life. But at the moment, I feel angry, I feel frustrated. Just let me feel angry and frustrated until I'm done processing this emotion. It's okay. I just have to be sure that in that moment I don't do anything that creates more permanent damage. I can punch a pillow, I can jump up and down, I can scream and yell, I can beat my hands on my chest, I can throw a tennis ball against the side of a garage as hard as I can and see if I can throw it hard enough to make the tennis ball split. which I have heard of happening, but not too often. Finding some way to vent all that angry energy or to redirect it in a positive fashion. In my case, when I'm really frustrated, I have this phenomenal amount of energy, and if it's because this thing won't do what it's supposed to do, and I direct the full energy of my anger at it, I sometimes find myself so strong that I can suddenly move it out of the way and get it to where it needs to be. There was one time where I was trying to haul some rocks with a pickup truck up this bank, and it started to rain, so the ground got slick and muddy and everything, and then the truck slid sideways and backwards and was wedged against a tree. And oh my God, I was so angry at being stuck there with the truck. But I refused to give up, and I kept doing everything I could think of doing, and because this anger was giving me all this energy, I didn't quit, and I didn't quit, and I didn't quit. And ultimately, I found what I needed, and I got some rocks under the tires or something. I don't remember exactly what it was now, even, because I was so angry. I got the truck out of there. And at the end of the day, the truck was back in the driveway, and I then had to figure out what to do about, the damage to the one side where it had scraped against the trees, but the truck was still drivable. It was not stuck up on the side of the hill in the slick, wet terrain. It was a problem that I did ultimately resolve by my perseverance and by applying some wisdom to it. For some people, the advice is step away, calm down, think about it, and you'll come back with a fresh idea. I think that's great if you can do it. In that instance, I couldn't do it. I was so angry and so driven to solve the problem. And I did ultimately solve the problem, but I had to let that emotion play out. And if anyone else had been there, which there wasn't, but if there had been, I would have just asked them to step back and just let me deal with this. And if you have a better idea, let me know. But if you don't have any idea, just stand back, and I will vent and fight and struggle with this. And by not leaving the situation, I did overcome it. That does not mean that's always the right answer, however, because there were other frustrations where I had to recognize that the adversary had more power on their side than I had on mine. And in recognizing that, I had to decide at what point and in what way to, quote, cut my losses or to escape from the situation. In the movie The Sound of Music, for example, Captain Von Trapp at various points expresses extreme frustration at what is happening politically around him. In the final moment, however, when he recognizes that they have more power than he has, they have more resources than he has, and they are not going to wait any longer before enslaving him. At that point, he chooses to leave behind his home, his estate, everything except the clothes he is wearing, and flee to safety over the border, so that he is not enslaved by the Nazi regime and made to serve in their military. He has to leave everything behind, and essentially that's what I had to do with this particular house that I had poured my heart and soul into. Literally my blood, sweat, and tears are in that house. But I got to the point where I had to recognize they are not going to allow me to live here. They don't care that I have full title to the house and it is absolutely 100% mine. They're not going to allow me to live within it, even though there is no verifiable danger anywhere in this house. They arbitrarily declared the house unsafe when it wasn't, and they weren't accountable to anyone to prove it. And I didn't have sufficient funds at the time to hire an attorney to make them prove it. And no one was willing to help me in that situation either. So I had to decide, in that moment of frustration, whether to let the frustration go to anger or let the frustration go to wisdom. And in my case, I chose to let it go to wisdom. I loaded up everything I could, and I left. And the house is still sitting empty exactly as I left it, and I keep praying that at some point I will be able to return and finish what I started, but I'm still trying to figure out where or how to find the resources to do that. That's the other thing about frustration, is that whatever is causing the frustration, as I said, it's something that exists within time. It's not infinite, it's not omnipotent, it's defined. And it can be that if you're able to step outside of that time to a place where it no longer has rule, you may figure out a better way of coming back to, not back to the time, but back to the place, and accomplishing something that wasn't possible within the time that you left, or in this case that I left. And I'm hoping and praying that I will be able to return with resources I didn't have available at the time that will allow me to create a different outcome. I guess the one thing about frustration is that it pushes me toward honesty. That it is this difficult emotion that begins to scrape off all the whitewashing and all the padding and all the euphemisms and all the ways that we try to smile our way through trouble and pretend that it doesn't matter, and sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me, and which is not true, by the way. They do hurt, and they do serious emotional and psychological damage sometimes. But instead of putting on that false front, I guess one could say, to look at the truth of the situation, realize when a power imbalance is in place, and how to, like as with martial arts, how to step out of the path of the blows so that it never really connects. The people who said I couldn't live in that particular house wanted to establish control over my life and enslave me to their wishes and their decisions and their narcissistic ways of propping themselves up, I guess. They were selfish and bullying people who had control and power and seemed to want to make themselves feel good by controlling the lives of others. I took that away from them. They couldn't. The only way that they could enslave me is if I stayed within that house. I ultimately had to choose, like Captain Von Trapp in the movie The Sound of Music, that freedom is more important than a particular address. And that if or when I was able to return with greater resources, I would absolutely do so. But in the short term, freedom was more important than having a particular address. So in that sense, when people ask me, what does freedom mean and what does it sometimes cost, I can honestly say that I know from experience what it means and what it sometimes costs. And I can tell the difference between being enslaved to a malevolent and untrustworthy bureaucracy and having the freedom to define one's home and living space and life in the way that one chooses to and in some cases needs to. Administrations are not always sympathetic or understanding of what is needed. They don't know their citizens in the way that people would know each other within a tribal society. To the extent that they don't know each other, it's well, like what they say about the road to hell, that it's paved with good intentions. The local administrators had all the best intentions within their own value system, because they did not know me, did not know my needs, and did not know how I could ultimately make a profoundly positive contribution to their community. They acted with the best intentions according to their values, understanding me to be a problem when I wasn't. I was actually a resource that they never utilized. They essentially, their good intentions paved the road to hell for me and created all sorts of problems of other sorts. But their perspective of the situation is not the only one, I guess is what I'm trying to say. There's frustrations that could have slid into an oppressive situation. Instead, I transformed those frustrations into the energy I needed to reestablish my freedom and to prevent their tyranny from taking hold of my life. And they still don't own the house, and they have rules about who can live there and under what circumstances and so forth. But it's like the house is still waiting, and the possibility of a recovery is still very real. And the limitations of those the small-minded people who are running that town, I believe, will ultimately be their undoing. I'm just not sure how quickly or in what way. How to cope with frustrations. Sometimes the frustrations do begin with other people. Sometimes they begin with ourselves. When we're doing something that is self-sabotaging, but we haven't gotten to a place where we recognize that it is. In both cases, recognizing that the frustrations are limited within time to a particular experience, to a particular moment even, particular season maybe, and that other possibilities are real and do exist. In those moments, I don't want someone throwing me simple platitudes like, look on the bright side. I'm feeling the emotion. I need to process the emotion. I can't repress it, stuff it, deny it, ignore it, throw it aside as if it didn't matter. The fact that I'm willing to struggle with that is the testimony that something within that moment truly matters. There is true value there that needs to be embraced, rescued, validated, or if necessary, that needs to have respectful closure put on it. That when I took my old English sheepdog to the veterinarian for the last time and discovered that he had just had a very severe stroke, and I was very frustrated that there was nothing we could do to save him, and she suggested that perhaps we could try this or try that, didn't know if it would do anything or not or whatever. And I said, no, he's 9 years old. This is a devastating situation. I don't want him lingering in the balance, lingering in suspension while we try all sorts of desperate measures, trying to see if we can just keep him alive, because it doesn't look at this point like he's going to have any quality of life. And so I had to love him enough to let him go. But I made sure that I was stroking his head and that his head was resting in my lap as he took his last breath, so that the last thing he would remember was my love for him, and that love would fuel his journey to the Rainbow Bridge, as they say. And that when it becomes time for me to make the crossing back to the spiritual realm, that perhaps, hopefully, ideally, he and I will meet again at the Rainbow Bridge, and I'm very much looking forward to that. Not in any hurry to make it happen sooner than it will, but very much looking forward to him being there at the Rainbow Bridge when my time comes. Frustrations, they come in so many different packages and so many different forms and so many different ways and from so many different sources. And the response is always on a case-by-case basis. There's not any one answer of how to deal with it. But I guess I'm hoping that in all I've shared in the last half hour, that the more ways you hear of how to address frustration, the more possibilities you will have in dealing with whatever frustrations you encounter in the future. But always remember that your spirit, your consciousness, needs to survive in some way, in some form, in order to begin to rebuild and to start anew. Because even if, like Captain Von Trapp in the movie Sound of Music, you are frustrated with what's happening with the Nazi regime and find that ultimately you can't make it stop, that to find something so valuable that you would survive it. And in his case, he found his freedom and the freedom of his family and his entire family. He kept his family together. He discovered new depths of love for them, new freedom for them, a new life in a new place somewhere else. And I'm quite certain that he wouldn't have traded all of that for keeping a house and while living under a Nazi regime. That I don't think he ever regretted his choice. And in combating frustrations as I have to face them each day, and when you're autistic, there are a lot of frustrations to face. Frustration never feels good. That doesn't mean it can't accomplish something good in spite of itself. In any case, thank you very much for watching. I hope some of the thoughts I've offered in the last half hour have been helpful to you.